I am Mia Wilson, and I was 29 the morning I sat across from my mother in a Manhattan cafe and let her real estate empire burn to the ground over a lukewarm cup of coffee. My older brother Derek was facing bankruptcy. My mother Brenda needed my signature on a quitclaim deed to liquidate a property and save him from his own financial ruin. She shoved a manila folder across the marble table without even looking at me. Her designer fingernails tapped a frantic rhythm against her phone screen. "Simon needs these signed by 3 o'clock, or the bank forecloses on your brother," she said. Her voice was tight with stress, for a son who never worked a hard day in his life. I looked at the folder, then I looked at the date on my watch. It was my 29th birthday. I waited for her to look up. I waited for her to notice the daughter sitting right in front of her. She just kept swiping through her emails. I asked her if she knew what day it was. She did not stop typing. "Oh, was that this week?" she muttered. "You know how things are right now. Derek is under so much pressure." 9 years, 9 consecutive years of the exact same dismissal. I was not a daughter. I was an invisible utility summoned only when the golden child needed a rescue. I did not raise my voice. I did not feel the sting of tears that used to haunt my teenage years. I just smiled. It was a genuine, quiet expression of closure. "Do not worry," I said smoothly. I slid out of the velvet booth and picked up my purse. "Looks like we both forgot something." Brenda finally stopped typing. Genuine confusion wrinkled her forehead. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Hand me the folder." "I left my pen at home," I replied. "The papers are unsigned." The color drained from her face. I turned my back on her and walked out into the cool New York air, leaving her sitting alone with a dying battery and a collapsing future. 6 hours later, my cell phone rang. It was Simon Caldwell, the family lawyer. He was screaming through the receiver. "Where are you?" he demanded. "The buyer is walking. The deal is dead. Do you have any idea what you just did to your family?" I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. Welcome back to QT Told Stories, where ordinary people set hard boundaries and quietly come out ahead. Tell me how old you were when you realized your family only loved what you could do for them. Drop your age in the comments and subscribe so the next story finds you too. People often wonder how a daughter becomes cold enough to walk away while her family loses everything. They assume it requires some explosive betrayal. It does not. A heart freezes slowly, drop by drop, through years of calculated erasure. To understand what happened in that cafe and what I spent the previous 9 years building in secret, I have to take you back to the day the freezing started, the day I turned 20. 9 years before I sat in that Manhattan cafe and watched a real estate deal collapse, I sat at the far end of a mahogany table in a crowded steakhouse on Long Island. It was the evening of my 20th birthday. The dining room hummed with the ambient noise of clinking silverware, ice swirling in crystal lowball glasses, and the steady roar of wealthy patrons congratulating themselves. The air smelled of charred butter, expensive wine, and curated success. My father Richard sat at the head of the table. He held up a glass of champagne, commanding the attention of the room. Beside him sat my mother Brenda, smiling with the kind of practiced radiance she reserves strictly for public audiences. Seated right next to her, soaking in the admiration like a sponge, was my older brother Derek. Derek was 24 at the time. He had just secured a junior account manager position at a mid-tier logistics firm. It was a role manufactured out of sheer nepotism, a favor called in by my uncle after Derek dropped out of his second attempt at a graduate program. He showed up to work late, missed crucial deadlines, and somehow continued to fail upward. In the Wilson household, Derek stumbling into a mediocre safety net was treated like a triumph of the human spirit. For my 20th birthday, there was no champagne toast. There was no mention of the date. There was only a reservation made for 12 people where I occupied the 12th seat near the swinging kitchen doors. I spent the evening dodging the sharp elbows of busboys carrying stacks of dirty plates. The spatial distance between my chair and the center of the celebration was not an accident. It was the architecture of our family dynamics rendered in physical space. I was the buffer zone. I was the silent observer enduring the painful isolation of being the forgotten presence at a crowded table. I watched my family operate from that distant end of the room. I studied them the way an outsider studies a foreign culture. My father paid the bills and avoided the emotional labor of raising children. He kept the peace by writing checks and nodding at whatever Brenda decided was the truth. My mother ran the family narrative. She decided who was thriving, who was struggling, and who required the most resources. Derek possessed a unique talent for manufacturing crises. He could turn a minor inconvenience into a grand tragedy requiring parental intervention. Because he constantly needed saving, he constantly received love. As the waiter cleared the dinner plates, the lights in our section dimmed. A sudden chorus of clapping erupted from the staff. 3 waiters approached our table carrying a large chocolate cake illuminated by sparklers. The icing spelled out a warm congratulatory message for Derek. He beamed cutting the first slice, while my mother took endless photos. I watched the sparklers burn down into ash. I waited for someone, anyone, to turn toward me. Nobody did. I leaned forward slightly. The cake plate was passed down the line, stopping 2 seats away from me. I looked at Brenda and spoke in a soft, even tone. "Mom," I said quietly, "it is October 12th today." Brenda paused mid-laugh. She lowered her phone and looked at me across the empty plates and half-empty wine glasses. She did not look embarrassed. She did not gasp or apologize. Instead, she offered a small, dismissive sigh, the kind you give a stubborn child tugging at your sleeve during a polite conversation. "Oh, Mia," she murmured, reaching over to pat Derek on the shoulder. "We are celebrating your brother tonight. He has worked so hard for this promotion. You are the resilient one. You are so capable. You do not need a big fuss made over you. You understand. You are the resilient one. You are so capable." I sat back in my chair and let those words settle into my bones. People often think being called capable is a compliment. In a toxic household, it is a life sentence. It is a convenient label parents use to justify their own emotional absence. By declaring me resilient, my mother absolved herself of the responsibility of parenting. By declaring me capable, she unilaterally decided I required 0 maintenance, 0 affection, and 0 consideration. I did not argue. Arguing requires hope, and I was fresh out of it. I sat quietly, eating a dry dinner roll, watching my brother inhale his chocolate cake. I realized a fundamental truth about my existence in their world. I was not a daughter. I was an invisible utility expected to function flawlessly in the background, power the household when needed, and demand nothing in return. We left the restaurant 2 hours later. The drive home offered no solace. My parents rode together in my father's pristine luxury sedan, Derek following close behind in a sports car they financed for him. I drove alone, in a rusted compact car I purchased using 3 years of waitressing tips. On the route back to their suburban neighborhood, I pulled into the desolate parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed a discordant rhythm above the empty aisles. I walked to the discount bakery rack. I found a plastic clamshell container holding a single leftover vanilla cupcake adorned with stiff, artificial pink frosting. I handed the tired cashier a few crumpled dollar bills. I sat in the driver's seat of my cold car in the parking lot. I opened the plastic container. The frosting was stale. The cake was dry. I took one bite, chewing slowly in the silence of the empty lot. It was the saddest birthday cake in the world, and it was exactly what I deserved for hoping they would change. I ate half of the cupcake and threw the rest out the window. That half-eaten piece of stale sugar was a stark physical manifestation of everything my family offered me: scraps, leftovers, and afterthought. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life. The drive back to my parents' house took 15 minutes, but the girl who parked in that driveway was not the same girl who had left for the steakhouse. The anger had burned off, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. If they wanted me to be self-sufficient, I would be self-sufficient. If they wanted me to be an invisible utility, I would become thoroughly invisible. I walked through the front door. The house remained silent, the air thick with the smell of my mother's expensive perfume lingering in the hallway. My parents were already asleep, exhausted from the hard work of celebrating their golden child. I walked up the stairs to my childhood bedroom. I did not turn on the main light. I pulled a single canvas duffel bag from the back of my closet. I packed with surgical precision. I bypassed the sentimental items, the photo albums, the trinkets from a childhood that always felt like a waiting room. I folded practical clothing. I took 2 pairs of jeans, a few sturdy shirts, my work boots, and a heavy sweater. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved the small metal lockbox containing my accumulated wages. I bypassed the kitchen counter where departing children usually leave a dramatic, tear-stained letter explaining their pain. I wrote nothing. Leaving a note implies a desire to be found. It signals a desperate hope that the reader might feel a twinge of guilt and chase you down. I harbored no such illusions. I already knew no one was going to chase me. I walked out the front door and locked it quietly behind me. I tossed the duffel bag into the passenger seat of my rusted car. I drove away from the Long Island suburbs without checking the rearview mirror. I vowed that night to never remind them of my existence again. I would use the very invisibility they forced upon me as an impenetrable shield. I would disappear into the background and construct a life so fortified that their toxic math could never subtract from my worth again. But stepping into the void requires survival. Building a fortress in the shadows demands capital grit and a willingness to endure profound exhaustion. The dawn following my departure brought a harsh reality check in a cheap motel room in the Hudson Valley. I stared at my meager savings, realizing that invisible armor is incredibly expensive to build. The real struggle was just beginning, and I had to learn how to turn cold neglect into cold, hard cash. I parked my rusted compact car outside a cheap motel in Poughkeepsie. The Hudson Valley is not just a collection of quaint weekend homes for Manhattan executives. It has a gritty, working-class spine if you know where to look. I secured a job sorting inventory for a local auction house. It was grueling, dusty labor. I spent 10 hours a day hauling heavy antique furniture, cataloging moldy books, and breathing in the decay of other people's forgotten lives. My hands grew calloused. My spine ached every night. I lived on instant noodles, cheap coffee, and pure spite. Every dollar I earned beyond basic survival went directly into certification courses. I refused to remain at the bottom of the ladder. I learned the meticulous art of estate appraisal. I studied provenance historical market fluctuations and the subtle tells of forgery. Within 3 years, I stopped carrying the heavy wooden cabinets and started pricing them. I launched my own liquidation firm catering to a very specific clientele. I specialized in handling the estates of the wealthy and the deceased. My daily routine involved walking into sprawling manors after a patriarch passed away and telling the grieving, greedy heirs exactly what their legacy was worth in cold, hard cash. I stripped away their sentimental delusions and handed them raw data. My profession evolved into a lens through which I viewed the entire world. It became my primary psychological defense mechanism. In estate appraisal, you learn quickly that a shiny veneer often hides rotting wood. You learn to identify a fabricated signature on a canvas or recognize when a supposedly priceless heirloom is just a clever imitation. I began to apply these professional standards to my own family. I audited my childhood. I ran a mental ledger of Richard and Brenda Wilson. I calculated their emotional investments, their consistent neglect, and the toxic liabilities they forced onto my shoulders. When I finalized the math, the result was incredibly simple. Their emotional value in my life had depreciated to zero. They were bankrupt assets. You do not hold on to bankrupt assets. You write them off. While I spent my 20s climbing out of the dust, Derek spent his descending into a cushioned abyss. I tracked his movements through the occasional inevitable gossip that drifted upstate from Long Island. Derek left the logistics firm after 12 months. He claimed the corporate structure stifled his visionary ideas. He convinced my parents to seed money for a boutique fitness franchise. He purchased state-of-the-art equipment, hired expensive trainers, and signed a premium commercial lease without a viable business plan. The venture folded in under 2 years, leaving a trail of broken contracts. He then pivoted to a digital marketing agency. He leased a high-floor office space he could never afford and filled it with designer furniture despite having zero actual clients. My parents funded every single failure. Richard liquidated a significant portion of his stock portfolio to cover a lawsuit filed by Derek's unpaid contractors. Brenda took out a secondary mortgage on their primary residence to settle his outstanding commercial leases. They bled their own security dry to maintain the illusion that their son was a brilliant entrepreneur. They threw pristine capital into a bottomless pit of incompetence. They blamed the economy, they blamed his business partners, they blamed everything except the son they refused to discipline. During those 9 years, I remained a ghost. My absence was not a tragedy to them. It was a convenience. It meant one less person competing for resources. They only reached out when they needed a minor administrative hurdle cleared. Once a year, my phone would light up with a Long Island area code. It was never a birthday wish. It was Brenda leaving a brisk voicemail asking if I remembered the password to a shared streaming account. It was Richard asking me to call a tax office and verify my old permanent address so they could claim a lingering deduction. I never answered the phone. I let the voicemails accumulate in a digital archive. I listened to their voices in the quiet of my office, analyzing their tone. There was never any worry. There was never any longing for a lost daughter. There was only the mild annoyance of an owner calling a broken appliance. I ignored every request. I changed my address, disconnected my social media, and vanished behind a corporate veil. I realized early on that responding, even to say no, was giving them a thread to pull. I gave them nothing. I funneled my soaring profits into a labyrinth of anonymous corporate entities. I created blind trusts and holding companies using registered agents. In the state of New York, a savvy operator can own the world and leave no paper trail linking back to their birth name. I built an impenetrable fortress of wealth. I drove an unassuming sedan and wore tailored, unbranded clothing. I rented a modest apartment while my business accounts swelled with seven-figure balances. To anyone looking from the outside, I was merely a mid-level consultant living a quiet, rural life. They had no idea I controlled millions of dollars in real estate and liquid capital. My family never bothered to look in my direction, so they never saw the empire rising right behind them. They assumed I was scraping by, struggling to pay rent, paying the price for walking away from their prestigious dining table. They derived a sick comfort from assuming I was a failure. I let them keep that comfort. It kept them away from my territory. This invisible machinery worked flawlessly for years. I was safe behind my corporate walls, content to let my family drown in their own manufactured crises. I spent my days appraising estates, unearthing hidden treasures, and identifying financial fraud for my clients. I became an expert at reading contracts and finding the loopholes that arrogant men thought they had cleverly hidden. I sharpened my mind until it was a lethal instrument capable of dismantling complex legal structures with a single glance. But predators always return to the hunting grounds when they run out of easy prey. The financial bleeding on Long Island eventually reached a critical threshold. The secondary mortgages and liquidated stocks were no longer enough to sustain Derek's delusions of grandeur. The parents needed a fresh source of capital, and they remembered the daughter they had discarded. 5 years into my self-imposed exile, my father broke the pattern of benign neglect. He did not leave a voicemail asking for a password. He did not send a casual text message. He drove 3 hours north, tracked down my rural office address, and waited for me in the parking lot of a local diner. He sat in his luxury sedan, holding a thick legal folder on his lap. He wore the desperate, calculated smile of a man who needed a signature. He was preparing to steal an inheritance I did not even know I possessed, operating under the fatal assumption that I was still the invisible, naive girl who ate stale cupcakes in grocery store parking lots. 5 years ago, on a damp Tuesday afternoon, the bell above a rural diner door chimed, signaling the arrival of the first real threat to my independence. Rain drummed a steady, dull rhythm against the greasy window panes. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth drinking black coffee. Outside in the gravel parking lot, my father stepped out of his pristine silver sedan. He adjusted the lapels of his expensive wool suit, looking around the run-down establishment with barely concealed distaste. He had driven 3 hours north from Long Island. He had not called ahead. He simply tracked down my business address, found it locked for lunch, and waited for me to emerge. He walked into the diner and slid into the booth across from me. He did not offer a hug. He did not ask if I was healthy or happy. He offered a tight, practiced smile, the kind a politician gives a local constituent before asking for a donation. I kept my face blank, studying him through the lens of my profession. In the estate appraisal business, you learn to spot distress. My father wore a luxury watch, but his eyes were tired. The skin around his jaw was tight with hidden stress. Derek was already draining his accounts, and Richard was hunting for fresh capital. He ordered a water from the waitress and immediately placed a thick manila envelope on the Formica table. He sighed, rubbing his temples to project the image of a weary patriarch burdened by heavy responsibilities. "Your grandfather passed away last month," Richard said. I nodded slowly. I already knew. I had read the obituary online. My grandfather was a stern, quiet man who spent his final years watching Richard spoil Derek into incompetence. We were never close, but he was the only person in the family who occasionally looked at me like I was a human being instead of a piece of furniture. "It is a mess, Mia," my father continued, leaning forward. "His estate is a tangled disaster. He left behind this old property, a derelict warehouse in Brooklyn. The roof is caving in. The city is threatening daily fines for code violations. The property taxes are a nightmare." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I let the silence stretch. I knew my father well enough to know he never drove 3 hours just to complain about a real estate headache. He drove 3 hours because he needed something from me. "We are trying to shield you from the liability," Richard said, his voice dropping into a register of fake paternal concern. "The lawyers need to close the estate. Because you are a listed blood relative, the city might try to come after your personal accounts for the back taxes. I had the legal team draft a waiver. It just transfers your nominal interest over to my management company so I can absorb the debt and liquidate the land for scrap. It protects you." He slid a single sheet of paper out of the envelope and pushed it across the table. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a pen. He handed it to me. It was a cheap promotional pen from a local commercial bank. The blue plastic casing was cracked near the grip. As I took it from his fingers, a thick bead of blue ink leaked from the seam and smeared across my index finger. I looked down at the dark stain on my skin. That leaky, broken pen was a perfect physical manifestation of his offer. It was cheap. It was messy. It was an afterthought designed to exploit me. It was the pebble that triggered an avalanche. I did not wipe the ink away. I set the pen down and picked up the document. My father assumed I was a naive girl scraping by in a rural antique shop. He had no idea I spent 60 hours a week analyzing complex estate transfers, identifying fraudulent property valuations, and auditing legal contracts for wealthy clients. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs. I bypassed the boilerplate language and zeroed in on the core clauses. It was not a management waiver, it was a full surrender of beneficiary rights. The specific legal phrasing indicated that I was relinquishing all current and future claims to the parcel number listed at the top of the page. I kept my breathing steady. The revelation settled in my chest, a freezing current of pure clarity. My father was lying to my face. I folded the document neatly and slipped it into my leather tote bag. I offered him a polite, vacant smile. "I will need to read the fine print, Dad," I said smoothly. "I have a friend who handles my small business taxes. She always tells me never to sign financial documents on the spot. I will mail it to you by Friday." Richard frowned. The paternal mask slipped, revealing a flash of sharp irritation. "Mia, do not be difficult," he snapped. "It is standard boilerplate text. I need to file it tomorrow morning to stop the city from issuing the fines. Just sign the paper." I picked up the cheap blue pen and dropped it into my bag next to the document. "I will mail it by Friday," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a cold authority he had never heard from me before. He stared at me for a long moment. He realized pushing harder might raise my suspicions. He forced his tight smile back into place, stood up, and left a $5 bill on the table. He walked out into the rain, confident he had planted the seed of fear. He assumed I would sign it to protect my meager savings. I drove straight back to my office. I walked into the private bathroom and scrubbed the blue ink off my fingers until my skin turned red. I sat down at my mahogany desk, booted up my computer, and logged into the New York Municipal Real Estate Database. I entered the parcel number printed on my father's fraudulent document. The loading screen spun for 3 seconds. The results populated. The property was not a crumbling, derelict liability. It was a pristine 40,000 square foot brick warehouse located in the heart of a rapidly gentrifying Brooklyn district. The zoning codes allowed for immediate, high-density commercial development. The current market valuation hovered in the multi-millions. I pulled the probate records. My grandfather was far sharper than Richard ever realized. The will bypassed my father entirely. The document explicitly deeded the prime Brooklyn assets solely to me. My grandfather saw the financial rot spreading through my parents and chose to secure my future instead. Richard, acting as the executor of the estate, was legally bound to notify me and transfer the title. Instead, he drafted a deceptive waiver, drove upstate, and tried to trick me into forfeiting my inheritance before the county could officially contact me. He intended to steal my building, sell it to a commercial developer, and use the cash to plug the gaping holes Derek was tearing in their bank accounts. I did not cry. I did not call my mother to demand an explanation. I picked up my phone and called Naomi Reed. Naomi was a ruthless real estate attorney based in Manhattan. She wore tailored suits, drank espresso like water, and spoke exclusively in legal strikes. I had consulted with her on complex estate liquidations in the past. She did not deal in emotions. She dealt in ironclad contracts. I drove down to her sterile, glass-walled office the next morning. I handed her my grandfather's will and the deceptive waiver my father tried to force me to sign. Naomi read the documents in silence. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and looked at me with cold, professional respect. "Your father is attempting a lateral theft," Naomi stated flatly. "He is banking on your financial illiteracy. If you had signed this, he would have filed it with the county recorder, effectively bypassing the probate directives. It is highly illegal but difficult to reverse once the ink dries." "We are not going to let the ink dry," I replied. "I want the deed locked down. I want it buried so deep in corporate structures that my father cannot even verify who owns the bricks." Naomi went to work. She was a legal surgeon. Within 48 hours, she filed the genuine title transfer documents with the county, bypassing my father's executor privileges by executing a direct beneficiary claim. She established a new blind holding company. We transferred the warehouse deed into the LLC, erasing the name Mia Wilson from all public property searches associated with the address. The back door my father tried to pry open was slammed shut, deadbolted, and welded solid. When Richard went to check the county records a week later, he would find the asset legally transferred and untouchable. He would have no legal recourse. He could not sue me for claiming my own inheritance, and he certainly could not admit to his country club friends that he tried to defraud his own daughter and failed. He was left with a failing son, dwindling bank accounts, and the silent, crushing realization that his invisible daughter had outsmarted him. I returned to my office in the Hudson Valley. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I placed the cheap, leaking blue pen inside a small, velvet-lined box. I kept it as a physical reminder of their treachery. Every time I felt a brief, irrational pang of guilt for ignoring my family, I opened that drawer. I looked at the blue plastic. The guilt always vanished, replaced by the cold, motivating fuel of survival. The warehouse was now legally mine. But a warehouse is just an empty shell of brick and steel. It generates no revenue while it sits vacant. It requires capital vision and relentless execution to transform potential into power. While Derek continued to burn through my parents' retirement funds on flashy, doomed ventures, I prepared to build my kingdom in the shadows. I was no longer just an appraiser. I was an invisible landlord, and I was about to turn my grandfather's gift into a weapon they would never see coming. 4 years is a considerable amount of time if you know how to leverage your resources. I did not let my grandfather's property sit idle. I funneled every dollar generated from my estate appraisal firm directly into raw materials. I did not hire a flashy development company or seek outside investors. I acted as my own project manager, operating entirely behind the impenetrable veil of a blind holding company. The physical transformation of that space required grueling labor. I oversaw crews sandblasting decades of grime off the original brick walls. We reinforced the steel support beams and poured fresh concrete floors. I curated the layout with ruthless precision. The derelict shell evolved into a sprawling, multi-level artisanal food hall and boutique commercial center. I handpicked the tenants to ensure maximum foot traffic and high profit margins. A collective of independent chefs, craft coffee roasters, and local artisans filled the 40,000 square feet. The air inside hummed with the rich scent of baked sourdough and roasting espresso beans. I walked the floors on busy weekend afternoons, wearing plain clothes, blending seamlessly into the dense crowds. I watched strangers share meals and laughter at long, reclaimed wood tables. My parents spent 2 decades ensuring I never had a seat at their table, leaving me isolated at the far edge of their lives. In response, I built a sprawling dining room capable of holding hundreds of people. I cultivated a thriving community of entrepreneurs who paid their rent on time and treated my management staff with respect. I became a highly successful, invisible landlord, holding the master key to a lucrative urban empire. While I spent those 4 years turning neglected brick into consistent revenue, my brother focused on projecting an illusion. Derek decided he was a visionary. He launched a software platform aiming to revolutionize corporate supply chain logistics. The inherent problem was that Derek did not know how to write code, nor did he possess any fundamental understanding of commercial logistics. He only understood the aesthetic of success. Before securing a single beta tester or generating a single dollar in revenue, he rented a penthouse office suite overlooking the Manhattan skyline. He furnished the space with ergonomic chairs, installed a nitro cold brew tap in the break room, and leased a foreign sports car to ensure he looked the part during meetings. His monthly burn rate was lethal. He coasted on the initial seed capital Richard and Brenda provided, but software requires actual development to survive. When the parental seed money evaporated, Derek went to traditional financial institutions. He carried a pristine, professionally designed pitch deck into boardrooms across the city. The bank loan officers wore cheap suits and carried practical calculators. They looked at his flashy presentation, analyzed his glaring lack of actual revenue, and politely showed him the door. Financial institutions do not lend eight-figure sums to a man whose only viable collateral is his own unchecked arrogance. The rejection sent Derek into a tailspin. He threw tantrums in his glass office, blaming the market and accusing the venture capitalists of lacking vision. As the eviction notices began piling up on his penthouse desk, the panic set in. He drove to Long Island and unleashed his desperation on our parents. Brenda and Richard could not tolerate the sight of their golden child facing the natural consequences of his own incompetence. Enabling him was their primary function, a shared pathology they mistook for parental devotion. The prospect of their country club friends discovering Derek was a failure terrified them more than financial ruin. To save the doomed tech venture, Richard pledged the entirety of his retirement portfolio. Brenda offered the deed to their sprawling suburban estate as collateral. They packaged their entire financial existence into a neat bundle and handed it to a desperate corporate broker. The broker shopped their high-risk portfolio around the private credit markets. Traditional lenders passed immediately. Eventually, a boutique private equity firm named Onyx Capital Partners agreed to review the file. The terms Onyx offered were predatory by design. The interest rates bordered on extortion. The default triggers were razor-sharp, granting the creditor the immediate legal right to seize all pledged assets the moment a single payment was missed by 24 hours. Derek did not care about the fine print. He only saw the immediate injection of cash required to keep his luxury office open. Richard and Brenda signed the guarantor forms, legally binding their home and their future to a software company that produced nothing of value. They celebrated the cash infusion with a champagne dinner, convinced they had outsmarted a rigid financial system. They did not outsmart anyone. They walked willingly into a steel trap. Onyx Capital Partners was not a faceless conglomerate located in a high-rise financial district. Onyx Capital Partners was a blind holding entity registered to a modest office in the Hudson Valley. It was my holding company. I was the anonymous private equity firm. The corporate broker who facilitated the transaction worked on my payroll. I did not tamper with my brother's business. I did not sabotage his software or interfere with his daily operations. I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy him. I simply approved the loan. I handed him the rope he demanded. I knew his entitlement would act as the perfect executioner. He would burn through the cash default on the strict terms and hand me the legal right to liquidate my parents' entire estate. I sat at my mahogany desk and reviewed the executed contracts. My father's signature sat on the dotted line, guaranteeing a loan provided by the very daughter he tried to defraud in a cheap diner 5 years earlier. The irony was a cold, satisfying weight in my hands. I filed the paperwork in a secure vault and returned to managing my thriving property. I let the clock run, knowing the tech startup was bleeding money every single day. But the trap I set yielded unexpected collateral damage. While my forensic accountants were verifying the collateral packages for the loan approval, they unearthed the glaring discrepancy in my parents' financial history. The numbers did not align with their reported income from the past 2 decades. The audit revealed a dark, buried secret. It was something far more sinister than a forgotten birthday or a stolen warehouse deed. The discovery shifted my motivation from simple self-preservation into something far colder. I was no longer just protecting my borders. I was preparing to collect a debt they thought they buried a long time ago. The discrepancy my forensic accounting team flagged was buried deep within a decade-old tax return. David Sterling served as the Wilson family accountant for 30 years. To secure the Onyx Capital loan, my parents had to sign comprehensive disclosure agreements. These documents granted my firm unfettered access to their entire financial history. They signed the waivers without hesitation, assuming a boutique private equity firm would only run a standard algorithmic credit check. They did not realize the CEO of the firm was an estate appraiser trained to spot fabricated ledgers. I sat in my office late on a Tuesday evening, the glow of my monitor illuminating the dark room. My lead auditor handed me a digitized file containing Sterling's archived records. The initial red flag was a sudden, unexplained injection of capital into Richard's primary checking account many years ago. It was a 7-figure deposit that appeared out of thin air. It lingered just long enough to be wired out to a private defense attorney and a series of corporate settlement accounts. I traced the routing number attached to that deposit. It did not originate from my father's stock portfolio or my mother's real estate holdings. It originated from an external closed account. I used my credentials to pull the archival banking records. The screen rendered a scanned PDF of a trust document. The header bore the insignia of a prominent wealth management bank. Below the bank logo, printed in stark black ink, was the title of the account, the Mia Wilson Endowment Trust. I stopped breathing. The silence in my office suddenly felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I scrolled down to the signatory page. My grandfather established the fund when I was 10 years old. He funded it with an initial deposit that accrued interest for nearly a decade. The stipulations written into the charter were explicitly clear. The capital was designated strictly for my future. It was meant to cover higher education, property acquisition, and independent security. My grandfather knew exactly what kind of people my parents were. He saw the toxic dynamic playing out in their suburban home. He recognized that I was the discarded child sitting at the far edge of the dining room table. He tried to build a financial fortress for me before his health declined. The ledger showed a robust, thriving balance right up until my 18th birthday. According to the documents, Richard was appointed as the temporary legal custodian of the trust. He held fiduciary responsibility until I reached the age of 21. He exploited that temporary custodial power. The withdrawal logs told a horrific story. Over a period of 3 weeks, my father systematically drained the endowment. He did not leave a single cent. He liquidated the conservative mutual funds, cashed out the bonds, and transferred the entire sum into his own personal holding account. He stole my future. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the empty balance on the screen. The betrayal was a physical ache, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I needed to know why. My parents were wealthy, but they were deeply status conscious. They did not steal millions of dollars to buy a yacht or fund a luxury vacation. They stole it because they were terrified. I followed the money trail out of Richard's account. The funds were dispersed in 3 rapid, desperate directions. One wire transfer went to a high-powered criminal defense firm in Manhattan. The second transfer went to a regional bank backing a local logistics firm. The third transfer was a direct wire to a private investigator specializing in corporate espionage and silence enforcement. I cross-referenced the dates of those transfers with my brother's timeline. Derek was 22 years old at the time. He had just returned home after failing out of his second graduate program. The family narrative claimed he was simply taking a gap year to find his true passion before securing his junior account manager role. That narrative was a lie, crafted to protect their fragile social standing. Derek did not take a gap year. He took an internship at a regional logistics firm, the exact same firm he would later miraculously join as an executive. During that brief internship, my brother committed a severe federal crime. Using the internal routing codes he was given to process shipping invoices, Derek diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars from the company accounts into an offshore shell entity he set up using fake credentials. It was not a clever scheme. It was sloppy, arrogant embezzlement, driven by a young man who believed rules did not apply to his bloodline. The logistics firm caught the missing funds within 2 months. They prepared to contact the authorities. A federal indictment would have resulted in a lengthy prison sentence, permanently destroying the pristine reputation Brenda and Richard worked so hard to curate. Faced with the imminent incarceration of their golden child, my parents panicked. They needed immense liquid capital to repay the stolen funds to cover the exorbitant legal retainer for a defense attorney and purchase the silence of the firm's board of directors. Their own assets were tied up in illiquid real estate and restricted stock options. They needed cash immediately. They looked at the trust my grandfather built for me. They looked at the safety net intended to guarantee my independence, and they decided my security was a fair price to pay for Derek's freedom. They drained my endowment, paid off the logistics firm, silenced the executives with strict non-disclosure agreements, and even purchased a junior executive position for Derek at that very same company to maintain the illusion of his success. That was the promotion we celebrated at the steakhouse on my 20th birthday. We were not celebrating his hard work. We were celebrating his successful evasion of a federal penitentiary funded entirely by my stolen inheritance. I sat in the dark for hours, processing the magnitude of the violation. For 9 years, I believed my parents merely forgot me. I thought they were simply too self-absorbed, too enamored with my brother to carve out space for a daughter who did not demand attention. I believed their neglect was passive. It was a painful reality, but it was a passive reality. The files on my screen shattered that illusion. Their abuse was not passive. It was active, calculated, and predatory. Every time Brenda told me I was resilient, every time Richard praised my independence, they were looking at a daughter they had secretly robbed. They watched me work grueling 10-hour shifts hauling dusty furniture at a rural auction house. They watched me drive a rusted compact car and eat stale grocery store cupcakes. They watched me struggle to build a life from the dirt, knowing they held the combination to a vault that would have changed my trajectory overnight. They chose their son's criminal comfort over my basic survival. The emotional wound opened deep and jagged, but it did not bleed sorrow. It bled a cold, unyielding resolve. The protective armor I built to shield myself from their neglect hardened into a weapon. I was no longer a discarded daughter trying to set boundaries. I was a creditor holding the undeniable proof of a stolen legacy. My family owed me a debt that transcended the Onyx Capital loan. They owed me for the years of exhaustion, the calculated deception, and the sheer audacity of funding their golden child's crimes with my grandfather's love. I closed the digitized ledger and locked my computer. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of my office, looking out over the sleeping Brooklyn streets. My motivation underwent a permanent paradigm shift. The game was no longer about keeping them out of my life. It was about dismantling theirs. I did not have to wait long to initiate the sequence. The trap I constructed was already in motion. Over in Manhattan, Derek's tech startup was hemorrhaging capital faster than anyone anticipated. His software platform was a catastrophic failure, rejected by every vendor he pitched. The initial cash injection from Onyx Capital was almost gone squandered on luxury office leases and high-end marketing campaigns that yielded zero return. The calendar on my desk indicated the first of the month was approaching. The first strictly enforced payment on the predatory loan was due. Derek did not have the funds to cover the interest, let alone the principal. The grace period was expiring. The golden child was about to step into free fall, and his desperate parents were about to realize the ground beneath their feet was a trapdoor I controlled. The first day of November brought a bitter chill to the eastern seaboard. It also brought the expiration of the 30-day grace period on the Onyx Capital loan. In the high-stakes financial sector, deadlines do not negotiate, they execute. Derek arrived at his Manhattan penthouse office at 10 in the morning. He carried a fresh cup of artisan coffee, ready to pretend he was a chief executive for another day. He stepped off the elevator and found the glass doors chained shut. A heavy brass padlock rested against the handles. A printed notice from the commercial landlord was taped to the glass, citing 3 months of unpaid rent. Derek dropped his coffee. It splashed across the polished marble floor. He pulled out his phone to call his bank, but the screen flashed a repossession alert. The foreign sports car he left with the valet downstairs was currently secured on the back of a tow truck heading for an impound lot. His software company was dead. It produced zero code, generated zero revenue, and now it possessed zero office space. He retreated to the Long Island suburbs on a commuter train, a man stripped of his expensive costumes. While Derek rode the train in stunned silence, the automated collection software at Onyx Capital activated. The algorithms did not feel pity. They registered a default on a high-yield debt instrument and triggered the pre-signed legal covenants. My father, Richard, was sitting in the dining room of his exclusive country club. He was hosting a luncheon for a local charity board, a position he maintained strictly for social leverage. When the bill arrived, he placed his premium credit card on the silver tray with practiced elegance. The waiter returned 3 minutes later. The young man leaned down and whispered that the card had declined. Richard offered a tight smile, assuring his guests it was a banking error. He handed over a second card. The waiter returned again with the same hushed apology. Richard excused himself and walked into the quiet mahogany hallway. He dialed his personal wealth manager. The response he received drained the blood from his face. A boutique private equity firm called Onyx Capital had executed a total asset freeze. Every checking account, every mutual fund, and every liquid stock portfolio tied to his Social Security number was locked pending seizure. The collateral clauses he signed to protect his son were ironclad. Miles away, my mother Brenda was arranging imported flowers in her sprawling foyer. A sharp knock interrupted her morning routine. She opened the custom wooden door, expecting a delivery courier. Instead, a process server handed her a thick manila envelope and walked away without a word. Brenda opened the envelope. It contained a formal notification of a property lien. Their pristine suburban estate was now collateral in active default. They could not sell it, they could not refinance it, and if the debt remained unsatisfied, the bank would evict them within weeks. The illusion of the Wilson family shattered before noon. By sunset, the three of them sat in their living room. The silence was heavy, suffocating, and entirely new to them. They were accustomed to solving problems by writing checks. Now the checkbooks were frozen. They realized they had exhausted their social capital and drained every hidden reserve. They needed liquid cash immediately to satisfy the Onyx default and release the lien on their pristine reputation. The thought of their wealthy neighbors watching a foreclosure auction on their front lawn was a fate worse than death. Richard went into survival mode. He locked himself in his home office, digging through decades of tax returns and property records. He searched for any overlooked asset, any forgotten stock certificate that might provide a bridge loan. His desperation led him to a dusty digital folder. He remembered the Brooklyn warehouse. He remembered the rainy afternoon in the rural diner 5 years ago. He remembered handing me a leaky blue pen and failing to secure my signature on a management waiver. He assumed the property was still a crumbling liability, a hazardous brick shell collecting city fines. But he also read the financial news. He knew Brooklyn real estate prices had soared. Even a condemned parcel of dirt in that district might fetch enough cash from a desperate developer to satisfy the Onyx debt. Richard logged on to the New York Municipal Tax Assessor portal. His hands shook as he typed in the parcel number. He expected to see a list of violations and a meager land valuation. The page loaded, revealing the updated municipal records. Richard took off his reading glasses, wiped the lenses on his shirt, and put them back on. He leaned closer to the monitor. The screen did not display a typographical error. The property was not a condemned liability. The municipal database registered the address as a Class A commercial retail center. The recent tax assessments reflected a staggering transformation. The valuation did not sit in the hundreds of thousands. It sat in the high 8 figures. The database noted active permits for high-capacity electrical grids, commercial kitchen ventilation, and a sprawling architectural footprint. My father pulled the digital property deed. Naomi Reed had structured my empire with surgical care. The daily operations, the tenant leases, and the revenue streams were shielded behind my anonymous LLC. However, to maintain perfect compliance with the airtight probate laws governing my grandfather's will, the core foundational deed to the physical land remained registered in my legal name. Mia Wilson was listed as the sole proprietor of a multi-million-dollar commercial hub. Richard printed the record. He carried the crisp white paper into the living room and placed it on the glass coffee table. Brenda and Derek stared at the astronomical valuation printed in black ink. The initial shock quickly morphed into a frantic, predatory calculation. They did not feel pride that their discarded daughter had built a thriving empire. They did not feel remorse for assuming I was a destitute failure living in the woods. They only saw a lifeline. They saw a vast reservoir of unearned capital ready to be harvested. They convened a desperate family council. The objective was clear. They needed to sell the Brooklyn property to a commercial developer to take the cash, pay off Onyx Capital, and restore their comfortable life. There was only one obstacle standing in their way. The title company would require the authentic signature of the deed holder to execute any sale. They needed my signature on a quitclaim deed. Richard formulated the strategy. They could not approach me with a direct demand. They remembered my cold refusal at the diner. They decided they needed to soften the ground. They needed to manipulate the naive, lonely daughter they believed still craved their approval. They assumed I had no idea how valuable the Brooklyn property had actually become. They theorized that a developer had built the structure without my knowledge, and that I was simply collecting a tiny ground lease while someone else reaped the real profits. They convinced themselves that I was still the same girl who ate a stale cupcake in a grocery store parking lot. They believed a few drops of fake maternal warmth would lower my defenses. They planned to invite me back into the family fold, shower me with the affection they had withheld for nearly a decade, and then slide a legal document in front of me disguised as routine administrative paperwork. They were orchestrating a masterclass in emotional manipulation. They were preparing to steal a golden goose to save their golden child. The sheer arrogance of their plan was poetic. They had no idea they were plotting to steal a building from the exact same private equity chief executive who was currently foreclosing on their home. They were sharpening their knives to hunt a ghost, unaware that the ghost was already standing right behind them, holding the deed to their destruction. Inside my Brooklyn office, the automated alerts chimed on my computer screen. The system confirmed the successful freezing of the Wilson accounts. I leaned back in my chair and watched the digital indicators turn from green to red. I knew my mother would be dialing my number very soon. I did not feel anxious. I felt the steady, calm rhythm of a trap snapping shut. The digital clock on my monitor turned to 3 in the afternoon. The smartphone resting on my desk illuminated. A familiar Long Island area code appeared on the screen. It was the call I had anticipated since the Onyx Capital default triggered. I did not pick it up immediately. I let the device vibrate against the polished mahogany, watching the screen pulse with incoming light. Answering too quickly signals desperation. Answering on the 4th ring signals a busy, unsuspecting life. I swiped the green icon and pressed the receiver to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply breathed, waiting for the predator to make the first move. "Mia, sweetheart, is that you?" The voice on the other end belonged to Brenda Wilson. The tone was entirely foreign. It was a masterclass in synthetic affection, dripping with a saccharine sweetness that made my teeth ache. She had not called me sweetheart in over 2 decades. The sheer artificiality of the greeting hung in the air, a thick coating of sugar, designed to disguise a lethal dose of poison. "My," replied, infusing my voice with a bright, eager cadence. I sounded like a daughter thrilled to finally receive a scrap of parental attention. "It is so good to hear from you. Is everything okay?" "Everything is wonderful, darling," Brenda lied smoothly. The strain in her voice was microscopic, detectable only to an appraiser trained to spot structural flaws. She was sitting in a house facing imminent foreclosure, her credit cards were frozen, and her social standing was teetering on the edge of a cliff. Yet she projected the breezy confidence of a suburban matriarch planning a garden party. "I was just thinking about you this morning," she continued. "It has been far too long since we really caught up. I feel terrible that we let so much time slip by. Your father and I miss you terribly. Even Derek was asking about you the other day. We all want to reconnect." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my leather executive chair. The audacity of her performance was almost admirable. Derek had not asked about me. Derek only asked about himself. But I understood the mechanics of the game. If I confronted her lies, she would retreat and formulate a more dangerous hidden strategy. I needed her to believe her manipulation was working flawlessly. "I miss you guys too," I said. My tone remained soft, compliant, and naive. "It has just been so busy up here with the shop." "Oh, your little antique business," Brenda cooed, seizing the opening. "It is so admirable how you keep yourself occupied. But you work too hard, Mia. You need to take a break. Come down to the city this Friday. Let us treat you to a nice family lunch, somewhere upscale. We can share a bottle of wine and just be a family again." The word family sounded hollow coming from her lips. She did not want a family. She wanted a signature. She wanted to lure me into a public setting to surround me with the intimidating presence of my father and brother and slide a legal document across the tablecloth. "That sounds lovely," I responded. "I can take the early train down." "Perfect," Brenda said, her relief palpable even through the cellular connection. "I will text you the restaurant details. We are so excited to see you, sweetheart." She ended the call. The dial tone echoed in my silent office. I placed the phone back on the desk. The first phase of their reconnaissance was complete. They had established contact, secured a meeting, and convinced themselves that the isolated, rural daughter was walking willingly into their embrace. They assumed my defenses were non-existent. They were fatally incorrect. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors on my desk. Playing the naive victim during a phone call was a necessary theatrical performance. Securing my assets required tangible, ironclad action. I remembered a specific tactic utilized by savvy property owners facing predatory relatives. A signature on a quitclaim deed can be coerced in a restaurant, but it can also be forged in a dark room. If my family grew desperate enough, they might attempt to bypass my physical consent entirely. They could fabricate my handwriting, hire a corrupt notary, and file the fraudulent transfer while I was busy appraising antique furniture. I opened a secure web browser and navigated to the official New York Municipal Clerk portal. I accessed the Deed Registry Division. The county offered a specialized digital security service designed to combat real estate theft. I typed in the specific parcel identification number for the Brooklyn Food Hall. I verified my identity through a multi-factor authentication process. I linked the property record directly to my encrypted private email server. I activated the county property fraud alert system. A confirmation message appeared on the screen. The digital tripwire was now live. If anyone attempted to file a lien, transfer, a title, or record a quitclaim deed against my parcel, the county database would instantly generate an emergency notification. I would be the first person to know if Richard or Derek tried to slide a forged document across a municipal counter. I secured the perimeter. I locked the gates. I picked up my phone and dialed a Manhattan number. Naomi Reed answered on the first ring. "The bait is in the water," I told my attorney. "Brenda just invited me to a family lunch this Friday. She wants to reconnect." Naomi let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Reconnect is a fascinating synonym for extortion. "Have they specified the venue?" "Not yet," I replied, "but they will choose somewhere expensive and intimidating. They want to exert maximum psychological pressure. They think they can corner me between the appetizers and the main course." "Do you want me present at the table?" Naomi asked. "I can draft a cease and desist order and serve it with the breadsticks." "No," I instructed. "If you show up in a tailored suit, they will panic and scatter. They need to believe they hold all the cards. I want them to lay their entire strategy on the table. I want them to present the fraudulent documents, articulate their demands, and incriminate themselves thoroughly. I need you on standby. I will bring the paperwork directly to your office after the lunch concludes." "Understood," Naomi said. "Do not sign anything, Mia, not even a napkin." I ended the call with Naomi and walked over to the wardrobe in my private office suite. Preparing for the lunch required careful costume design. I could not arrive wearing my custom Italian wool blazer or carrying my designer leather briefcase. Those items signaled wealth, authority, and financial literacy. I needed to project the exact opposite. I sifted through the garments until I found an outfit that fit the narrative my parents had spun about me. I selected a pair of practical, faded slacks and a modest beige cardigan. I chose scuffed flat shoes instead of heels. I found an old canvas tote bag to use as a purse. The ensemble screamed rural mediocrity. It was the uniform of a woman who clipped coupons, worried about heating bills, and desperately sought the approval of her wealthy suburban relatives. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The disguise was flawless. The woman staring back at me looked vulnerable, tired, and remarkably easy to manipulate. Brenda and Richard would look at this outfit and feel a surge of predatory confidence. They would assume the negotiation was already won before the first glass of water was poured. I turned away from the mirror and walked back to my desk. The sun was beginning to set over the Brooklyn skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor of my office. The commercial hub I built hummed with life a few floors below me, a multi-million-dollar engine generating undeniable power. My parents were preparing a meticulous trap. They were polishing their smiles, rehearsing their lies, and printing their deceptive legal forms. When the spider invites the fly to dinner, what happens when the fly already owns the web? I packed my canvas tote bag and prepared for Friday. The Wilson family was about to host a reunion, and I intended to bring an appetite they never saw coming. The restaurant Brenda chose was a cathedral of modern wealth, located deep in Midtown Manhattan. The ceilings vaulted high above the dining floor, designed to capture and mute the hushed, expensive conversations of hedge fund managers and real estate developers. The air smelled of seared truffles and polished silver. I walked through the revolving glass doors wearing my faded beige cardigan and carrying my battered canvas tote bag. The hostess at the front podium evaluated my attire in a fraction of a second. Her professional smile dropped several degrees in warmth, categorizing me as someone who did not belong in her exclusive establishment. I gave her the reservation name. She led me past the sprawling main dining room toward a secluded private alcove in the back. As I turned the corner, the scope of my mother's deception came into full view. It was not a family lunch. It was a calculated ambush. 5 people sat around a circular mahogany table. My mother Brenda and my father Richard occupied the seats facing the entrance. My brother Derek sat to their right, his leg bouncing with nervous energy under the tablecloth. Beside him sat his wife Kelly. I had only met Kelly a handful of times. She grew up in a modest neighborhood, spending her entire adult life striving to marry into an elite social tier. She bound herself to Derek for the illusion of security and status. Now that the Onyx Capital default was tearing that illusion apart, her features were pinched with raw, unfiltered panic. She gripped the stem of her wineglass like it was a weapon. The 5th person at the table was a stranger. He sat directly across from my designated empty chair. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a silk tie, and the arrogant posture of a man who billed $1,000 an hour to intimidate people. "Mia, sweetheart," Brenda called out, standing up to offer a hollow performative embrace. I let her arms briefly encircle my shoulders. I took my seat, placing my canvas tote bag on the floor. "I see we brought a guest," I said, keeping my voice bright and carefully confused. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to project patriarchal authority. "This is Simon Caldwell, Mia. He is a corporate attorney assisting the family with some administrative restructuring." Simon did not offer his hand. He merely nodded, looking at my scuffed flat shoes and my cheap cardigan. His eyes calculated my net worth and found it laughable. He was a legal mercenary, a man hired to bulldoze obstacles. He viewed me as a minor inconvenience, a naive rural shopkeeper standing between his clients and a lucrative real estate liquidation. We did not order appetizers. We did not discuss the menu. Simon reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a dense, thick stack of legal documents. He dropped the paperwork onto the center of the table. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet alcove. "We are cleaning up some old legacy files," Simon began, his voice a smooth, rapid baritone designed to overwhelm the listener. "Your grandfather left a fragmented estate portfolio. There is a specific parcel of land in Brooklyn, a defunct commercial shell that requires immediate remediation. The city is preparing to levy significant environmental hazard fines against the deed holder. Since your name was tangentially listed on the original probate trust, we need to insulate you from the impending tax liability." He slid the stack of papers across the polished wood. It stopped an inch from my water glass. I looked down at the document. It was 60 pages long. The bold print at the top of the first page clearly identified the instrument as a quitclaim deed accompanied by a total surrender of beneficiary rights and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Simon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "It is standard corporate housekeeping," he said smoothly. "We transfer the nominal title to your father's holding company. He absorbs the tax penalty, and you walk away clean. We just need your signature on the back 3 pages to finalize the indemnification." I looked up from the paper and deployed my strategy. I widened my eyes, let my shoulders slump, and manufactured a look of deep, overwhelming anxiety. "Oh my," I whispered, letting my voice tremble slightly. 60 pages? That seems like an awful lot of paperwork just to clean up an old file. I am terrible with legal jargon. It always gives me a terrible headache. Simon offered a patronizing smile. His ego took the bait immediately. He assumed I was drowning in his legal terminology. There is no need to read the boilerplate language, Mia. It outlines the amortization of the municipal fines and the transfer tax exemptions. It is tedious regulatory text. I have already reviewed it to ensure you are fully protected. I looked around the table. Derek was glaring at me, his jaw clenched silently, demanding I comply. Kelly was holding her breath. Brenda offered a tight maternal nod, trying to project soothing reassurance. "Listen to Simon, sweetheart," she murmured. "We are just trying to help you. We do not want you burdened with grandfather's old debts." I reached out and placed my hand on the 60-page document. I ran my fingertips over the crisp paper. I was executing a precise psychological maneuver. I needed them to believe they had won, so they would let their guard down and hand me the physical evidence of their fraud. Simon retrieved a heavy gold pen from his breast pocket. He uncapped it and extended it toward me. The entire table froze. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded into a sharp, defining silence. I could hear the ice shifting in Brenda's water glass. I could hear Derek's rapid, shallow breathing. Their entire financial survival hinged on the movement of my right hand. I took the gold pen. It was cool and heavy in my grip. I flipped to the final page of the document. I found the empty signature line bearing my printed name. I hovered the ink nib a fraction of an inch above the paper. The tension in the alcove was intoxicating. I held the pen there for 3 agonizing seconds, letting them taste the victory. I let them imagine the millions of dollars flooding into their bank accounts. I let Derek picture a new sports car, and Kelly envision her pristine social standing restored. Then I pulled the pen back. I capped the gold instrument and set it gently beside the document. I offered Simon a sweet, apologetic smile. "I have this silly little quirk," I said, my voice dripping with manufactured rural innocence. "My friend upstate helps me with my small business taxes. She always yells at me if I sign financial documents at a lunch table. She says I have to read every single page in my own living room before I put my name on anything. It is just a strict rule I follow." Simon's patronizing smile vanished. His professional veneer cracked, revealing the aggressive predator underneath. He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a sharp, threatening register. "Mia, this is not a suggestion. The commercial buyer for this land has set a strict closing deadline. If we do not execute the transfer by Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the deal collapses. Your family will be exposed to catastrophic financial penalties. You need to sign the paperwork right now." I picked up the thick stack of documents and slid them directly into my canvas tote bag. "Then I will be sure to read very quickly," I said, maintaining my bright, oblivious tone. "I will bring the signed folder to you on Friday morning, Simon, right before your 3 o'clock closing. That way, everyone gets exactly what they need." I stood up from the table, sliding my chair back against the carpet. The faces staring back at me were masks of pure, frustrated desperation. Derek opened his mouth to shout, but Richard placed a heavy hand on his son's forearm, silencing him. Richard knew that causing a scene in a midtown restaurant would only push me away. They had to play along with my timeline. They had no other leverage. "Thank you for the lunch invitation, Mom," I said smoothly. "I will see you on Friday." I turned and walked out of the alcove, leaving them trapped in their own silent panic. I navigated through the bustling dining room, stepped through the revolving doors, and hailed a black car waiting on the avenue. 15 minutes later, I walked into the sleek, glass-walled offices of my real estate attorney. Naomi Reed was sitting at her conference table, reviewing a digital contract. I walked in, opened my canvas tote bag, and dropped the 60-page quitclaim deed onto her desk. "The spider tried to serve the fly," I said, taking a seat across from her. Naomi picked up the document. She spent 10 minutes reading through the dense legal text in utter silence. Her eyes tracked the paragraphs, analyzing the traps Simon Caldwell had so carefully laid. When she reached the final page, she tossed the packet back onto the table. Her expression was a mix of professional disgust and sharp admiration. "This is brilliant in its cruelty," Naomi noted. "It is not just a quitclaim. Caldwell buried a release of liability clause in the 7th section. If you had signed this, you would not just be surrendering the multi-million-dollar food hall. You would be retroactively forgiving Richard for draining your childhood trust fund. The language specifically absolves the previous legal custodian of any fiduciary mismanagement. They were trying to steal your building and erase their past crimes with a single stroke of a pen." I leaned back in the chair, absorbing the reality of their malice. They did not just want to save themselves, they wanted to ensure I could never seek justice for the money they stole a decade ago. "We have the physical evidence of attempted coercion and fraud," Naomi said, tapping her fingernail against the document. "What is your next move?" "My next move is patience," I replied. "The deadline is Friday at 3 in the afternoon. Until then, they are going to panic. They are going to realize that a quiet, polite delay is far more terrifying than an outright refusal. They are going to unravel, and they are going to put their desperation in writing." I left the documents in Naomi's secure vault and returned to Brooklyn. The trap was fully constructed, the bait was swallowed, and the countdown to Friday had officially begun. The quiet delay I promised them was about to transform into a relentless psychological siege. The illusion of polite negotiation evaporated exactly 4 hours after I walked out of that midtown alcove. When a predator realizes the prey has secured the leverage, the mask of civility dissolves, revealing raw desperation underneath. My Wednesday evening began in the quiet sanctuary of my Brooklyn office. The sun dipped below the city skyline, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floors. I sat at my desk, reviewing inventory manifests for my commercial tenants. The smartphone resting next to my keyboard remained silent for most of the afternoon. My family was busy calculating their next move, likely huddled in Richard's suburban study, realizing I walked away with the physical copies of the quitclaim deed. They had no duplicates. They had no control. The digital clock struck 8. The barrage commenced. The first notification shattered the silence. It was a text message from Derek. My brother never possessed the stamina for a prolonged strategic waiting game. He demanded instant gratification his entire life, trained by parents who handed him rewards for merely existing. The thought of a younger, invisible sister holding his financial salvation hostage drove him into a rabid frenzy. I opened the message thread. The incoming texts arrived in rapid, unhinged bursts. "What is wrong with you? Stop playing games. Dad said you took the paperwork. Bring it back tonight. We are not waiting for your stupid accountant. You are such a useless, selfish sister. You have no idea what is at stake here. Sign the damn papers, Mia, or I swear I will come up to that rural shack you live in and make you sign them." I read the words glowing on the screen. A decade ago, a barrage like this would have sent a spike of panic through my chest. I would have scrambled to appease him, desperate to avoid the inevitable screaming match. But I was no longer a frightened 20-year-old girl. I was a seasoned estate appraiser, and I knew how to handle toxic liabilities. I did not type a reply. I did not attempt to defend myself or reason with a man drowning in his own incompetence. I pressed the buttons on my phone to capture a digital screenshot of the conversation. I saved the image files into a secure encrypted folder labeled with his name. Every threat, every insult, every documented attempt at coercion was another brick in the legal fortress I was constructing alongside Naomi Reed. He was willingly handing me the evidence required to secure a permanent restraining order. The night wore on. Derek's frantic texting eventually subsided, replaced by a far more insidious tactic. The following morning, Thursday, dawned overcast and cold. I arrived at my food hall early, securing a cup of artisan coffee from one of my ground floor vendors. When I returned to my executive suite, the voicemail indicator on my phone blinked with a steady red light. Brenda had taken over the assault. I pressed play on the first audio file. My mother utilized a weapon she honed throughout my childhood, manufactured fragility. She bypassed anger and went straight for emotional blackmail. "Mia, please pick up the phone." Brenda's voice echoed through the speaker, trembling with practiced sorrow. "Your father did not sleep a wink last night. His blood pressure is spiking. His doctor warned us about this kind of stress." She paused, letting a ragged theatrical sob escape into the receiver. "You are destroying his heart, sweetheart. We just want to protect the family. Why are you doing this to us? Please just bring the folder today. Do not be the reason your father ends up in a hospital bed." I leaned back in my chair, listening to the recording play a second time. It was a brilliant performance. She painted me as the ruthless villain inflicting medical trauma on a frail patriarch. She conveniently omitted the fact that Richard's stress originated from a looming private equity foreclosure, a disaster they orchestrated by funding their son's fraudulent lifestyle. I connected the device to my computer tower, I extracted the raw audio files and cataloged them into a secondary encrypted folder. I documented the timestamps and the duration of each call. Brenda left 3 more voicemails before noon, escalating the guilt trip with every recording. She threatened to cut me out of the family, seemingly unaware that I severed those ties 9 years ago in a grocery store parking lot. By Thursday afternoon, the third flank of their offensive engaged. My email inbox chimed. The sender was Kelly, my sister-in-law. She operated from a place of cold corporate entitlement. She lacked the fiery rage of her husband and the theatrical grief of her mother-in-law. Her correspondence was passive-aggressive, dripping with the snide superiority she adopted when she married into the Wilson name. The subject line read, "Doing the right thing." Mia, the email began, "I know we have not always been close, but this situation requires maturity. Derek is under immense pressure building his software company, and your stubborn refusal to sign routine administrative paperwork is incredibly disruptive. Real families support each other during turbulent times. It is time for you to demonstrate some loyalty. Bring the documents to the city tomorrow. Let us put this petty rebellion behind us so Derek can focus on his business." I read the sterile, demanding paragraphs. Kelly was lecturing me about family loyalty while actively participating in a conspiracy to steal my grandfather's inheritance. She was ordering me to facilitate Derek's imaginary success, completely blind to the reality that his software company was a bankrupt shell locked behind a brass padlock. I clicked the forward button. I sent the email directly to Naomi's paralegal team to be added to the growing dossier of coercion. The psychological siege continued unabated for 36 hours. They pelted my phone with demands, insults, and tears. I absorbed the entire barrage in absolute silence. I became a digital void. I offered zero resistance, zero clarification, and zero comfort. The silence infuriated them more than any argument ever could. It forced them to stare into the abyss of their own powerlessness. The dramatic irony of the situation was a masterpiece. I sat in my spacious office looking at a dual-monitor setup. The left screen displayed the encrypted folder containing their frantic, desperate threats. The right screen displayed the proprietary dashboard for Onyx Capital Partners. The financial software tracked the active foreclosure proceedings against the Long Island estate and the Manhattan penthouse. My family was launching a coordinated, ruthless harassment campaign against the exact creditor who held their entire financial existence in her hands. They were screaming at the executioner. Every text message Derek sent demanding my submission accelerated his own doom. Every sobbing voicemail Brenda left attempting to manipulate my empathy merely fortified my resolve. They believed they were applying maximum pressure to a weak, isolated target. They had no idea they were throwing stones at a reinforced steel vault. As Thursday evening transitioned into Friday, the desperate communications reached a fever pitch. The commercial buyer's deadline was set for 3 o'clock the following afternoon. The window for their salvation was rapidly closing. They needed the quitclaim deed, and they needed my authentic signature on the dotted line. At 10 o'clock on Thursday night, my phone buzzed one final time. It was a text from Brenda. The fake warmth was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, dictatorial command. "Meet me at the espresso bar near Simon's office tomorrow morning, 9 sharp. Bring the folder. We are done waiting." I stared at the glowing text. Tomorrow was Friday, the 12th of October. It was my 29th birthday. My mother was summoning me for a final showdown. She intended to bully me into submission over a morning coffee, secure the stolen asset, and race to the lawyer's office to finalize the deal. She expected a terrified, compliant daughter to show up and surrender the keys to a multi-million-dollar kingdom. I locked my computer screens and turned off the office lights. The paper trail was complete. The evidence of their coercion was securely archived. The trap was fully constructed and primed for detonation. I picked up my canvas tote bag, walking out into the quiet Brooklyn night. I needed to rest. Tomorrow morning, I had a birthday coffee to attend, and I intended to deliver a gift they would never forget. Friday morning dawned gray and unforgiving across the New York skyline. I woke up in my Brooklyn apartment with a clear mind. The relentless digital harassment from my family had ceased around 2 in the morning, leaving a quiet, static calm in its wake. I dressed carefully for the final act. I bypassed the tailored business attire that defined my professional life. I put on the same faded slacks and beige cardigan I wore to the ambush lunch. I slung the battered canvas tote bag over my shoulder. Inside the bag rested the thick manila folder containing the 60-page quitclaim deed Simon Caldwell had drafted. The pages remained pristine. The signature lines remained blank. I also packed one additional item. I opened my desk drawer and retrieved the small velvet box containing the cheap promotional pen my father tried to force upon me 5 years ago. The blue plastic was still cracked. The dried ink still stained the rim. I placed it at the bottom of my tote bag and walked out the door to catch a train into Manhattan. The espresso bar in Tribeca hummed with the usual morning rush of corporate executives and affluent residents. I arrived at 5 minutes to 9. I spotted Brenda Wilson immediately. She occupied a velvet booth tucked into the back corner of the cafe. From a distance, she looked like the polished suburban matriarch she always pretended to be. Up close, the facade showed severe structural damage. As an estate appraiser, I read physical deterioration the way other people read the morning news. Brenda wore a designer trench coat, but the belt was tied in a hasty, uneven knot. The makeup around her eyes was applied with a heavy hand to conceal deep, bruised shadows of exhaustion. She had not slept. The Onyx Capital default was a heavy weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her pristine estate on Long Island was currently locked under a property lien, and her golden child was bankrupt. Her entire universe hinged on the commercial real estate closing scheduled for 3 o'clock this afternoon. I approached the table and slid into the booth across from her. She did not look up. Her French manicured fingernails tapped a frantic, irregular rhythm against the marble tabletop. Her eyes remained locked on the glowing screen of her smartphone. She was swiping through emails and typing rapid responses, likely coordinating with Simon Caldwell to ensure the buyer was ready to wire the funds the moment the deed transferred. "Simon needs those papers by 3 o'clock, Brenda muttered to the screen. Her voice was tight, thin, and brittle. If the buyer walks, the bank forecloses on Derek by Monday. He will lose the house. We will lose the collateral. You brought the folder, right? She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask about my train ride. She summoned a utility to perform a function. I sat across from the woman who gave birth to me. I looked at the mother who secretly drained a multi-million-dollar trust fund designed for my future just to pay off a federal embezzlement charge for my brother. She sacrificed my security to purchase his freedom, and now she was demanding I sacrifice my hard-earned commercial property to save him a second time. She believed she was orchestrating a brilliant rescue mission. She assumed she would take the folder I brought her, deliver it to Simon Caldwell, and finalize the sale of the Brooklyn warehouse to a commercial developer. She thought the developer would wire the purchase funds into my father's holding account. She planned to use those funds to pay off the Onyx Capital default release, the lien on her suburban estate, and restore the family to their previous social standing. She failed to realize the structural flaw in her master plan. Onyx Capital was not a faceless financial institution. Onyx Capital was my anonymous holding company. The debt she was trying to pay off was owed directly to me. Even if I had signed the quitclaim deed, she would merely be liquidating my asset to pay my own invoice. But I had no intention of signing away the food hall I built from scratch. I intended to keep my property and collect the collateral she pledged. It was a perfect, inescapable checkmate. I stirred my black coffee. The silver spoon clinked softly against the ceramic mug. The sound seemed to vanish into the noisy cafe. I decided to offer her one final, microscopic chance at redemption. I wanted to see if any shred of maternal awareness existed beneath her desperate greed. "It is a significant day today, Mom," I said quietly. "Friday, the 12th of October. Brenda frowned at her screen. She typed another rapid reply to an incoming message. She did not pause to process my words. She did not search her memory. The date held zero value in her personal ledger. "Oh, was that this week?" she murmured. The words were a hollow, automated response. "You know how things are right now. Derek is under so much pressure. We can do a dinner next month." There it was. The 9th consecutive erasure, the final confirmation that my family was fundamentally unredeemable. A decade ago, that sentence would have carved a hollow cavity in my chest. I would have felt the familiar, suffocating sting of being forgotten. Today, sitting in that velvet booth with a multi-million-dollar real estate empire shielded behind an anonymous holding company, I felt nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. The emotional tether connecting me to the Wilson family snapped clean. I did not raise my voice. I did not deliver a dramatic monologue about her failures as a parent. The calm person in the room is always the one holding the power. I smiled a genuine, quiet smile of closure. I reached into my canvas tote bag and retrieved the heavy manila folder. I placed it gently on the center of the marble table, right next to her tapping fingers. "Do not worry," I said smoothly. I slid out of the velvet booth and stood up. I draped my coat over my arm. "Looks like we both forgot something." Brenda finally stopped typing. Her thumb hovered over the glowing screen. Genuine confusion wrinkled her forehead. She looked up at me, then down at the folder resting on the table. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice laced with sudden irritation. "Where are you going?" I did not answer her. I turned my back and walked away. I navigated through the crowded cafe, pushing open the heavy glass doors. The cool, damp New York air hit my face, clearing the cloying scent of her expensive perfume from my lungs. I left her sitting alone in the booth. In a few seconds, she would open that folder. She would flip to the final page. She would find the signature lines entirely blank. I stood on the sidewalk as morning commuters rushed past me. I reached into the bottom of my tote bag. My fingers brushed against the cracked blue plastic of the cheap promotional bank pen. My father had handed me this pen in a rural diner 5 years ago, assuming I was naive enough to sign away my grandfather's gift. I kept it as a physical reminder of their treachery, a tool to fuel my survival when the days grew long and the labor grew heavy. I did not need the reminder anymore. I had survived. I had built a kingdom in the shadows, and the people who tried to bury me were now standing directly over a trapdoor they built themselves. I walked over to a green municipal trash can bolted to the concrete sidewalk. I held the pen over the open grate. I let it fall. The plastic clicked against the metal bottom, a tiny, insignificant sound swallowed by the roar of the city traffic. The release was profound. I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding since I was 20 years old. I looked at the silver watch fastened around my wrist. The hands indicated 9:15 in the morning. Simon Caldwell had scheduled the commercial real estate closing for 3 o'clock this afternoon. The buyer was likely reviewing the final transfer terms, expecting to take possession of a lucrative Brooklyn food hall. My parents were expecting a wire transfer large enough to satisfy the Onyx Capital default. The gears of their destruction were already turning, and they had no idea the engine was empty. I flagged down a passing taxi and gave the driver the address to my Brooklyn office. The countdown to 3 o'clock had officially begun, and I wanted to be sitting at my desk when the sky finally fell on Long Island. I returned to my Brooklyn office just before noon. The artisanal food hall operating on the ground floor below me hummed with the Friday lunch rush. I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of commerce through the floorboards. The clatter of plates, the hiss of espresso machines, the steady rhythm of a thriving enterprise. I sat behind my mahogany desk and looked at the dual monitors. The left screen displayed the proprietary dashboard for Onyx Capital Partners. The right screen displayed a simple digital clock in stark white numerals. The numbers ticked forward, slow and inevitable. I spent the early afternoon reviewing inventory logs, projecting a calm exterior while the final grains of sand slipped through the hourglass. I knew exactly what was happening in Midtown Manhattan. I could envision the sleek glass-walled conference room in Simon Caldwell's law firm. I pictured the commercial developer sitting at a polished table, a luxury pen in hand, ready to acquire a prime piece of real estate. I imagined my mother Brenda and my father Richard sitting on the opposite side, holding their breath, waiting for the financial transaction that would wipe away their sins. They believed the manila folder Brenda carried held the key to their salvation. They thought they had successfully manipulated their invisible daughter into surrendering her kingdom. 2 o'clock passed, then 2:30. The silence in my office felt thick and electric. At exactly 3 o'clock, the digital numbers on my monitor shifted. The deadline arrived. I leaned back in my leather executive chair and waited. I did not have to wait long. At 3 minutes past the hour, the smartphone resting on my desk began to vibrate. The screen flashed with Simon Caldwell's direct office line. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the rhythmic pulse of the device. On the 4th ring, I swiped the green icon and held the receiver to my ear. I did not speak. "Mia, what the hell is this?" Simon shouted. The smooth, patronizing baritone he used at the restaurant was gone. His voice cracked sharp and frantic. The polished corporate attorney was unraveling in real time. "I opened the folder your mother brought. The signature lines are blank. The indemnification clauses are blank. You did not sign a single page." I kept my breathing steady. "I told you I had a quirk about reading things in my own living room," I replied. My tone was conversational, light, and entirely unbothered. "I read the documents, Simon. I simply chose not to endorse them." "The buyer is packing his briefcase," Simon yelled, the background noise of his conference room filtering through the receiver. I could hear a heavy wooden door slamming. I could hear my mother issuing a high-pitched, panicked gasp. "You cannot do this. We had a verbal agreement at the lunch table. You are intentionally sabotaging a high-yield commercial transaction. I will sue you for breach of contract. I will drag you into civil court and bleed your accounts dry for tortious interference. You just destroyed your own family." The threats rolled over me like water. A younger version of myself might have cowered at the prospect of a high-powered lawsuit, but I was an estate appraiser. I understood the precise definition of a legally binding contract, and I knew Simon was clutching at straws. "We did not have a verbal agreement," I stated. My voice dropped its manufactured innocence. It hardened into the cold, authoritative register I used to dismiss fraudulent claims. "We had a lunch where you attempted to coerce a signature using deceptive legal jargon. You tried to force a quitclaim deed on a property you do not control to benefit clients who are drowning in toxic debt." "Listen to me, you arrogant little girl," Simon spat, his professionalism disintegrating into raw venom. "You are going to get in a cab, you are going to drive to this office, and you are going to sign these papers right now. If you do not, your brother goes to prison for defaulting on his corporate loans, and your parents lose their home. Their blood will be on your hands." I looked at the Onyx Capital dashboard glowing on my left monitor. The indicator lights next to the Wilson family accounts were still red, indicating a frozen status. It was time to deliver the final appraisal. "Your clients are voided assets, Simon," I said. The words sliced through the receiver, precise and surgical. "Their emotional and financial value has depreciated to 0. They stole my childhood trust fund to cover a felony embezzlement charge 10 years ago, and now they are trying to steal my commercial property to cover a second failure. They are bankrupt ledgers. I am not signing anything. I suggest you step away from this sinking ship before you lose your license to practice law for facilitating coercion and fraud." I pressed the end call button. The line went dead. I placed the phone face down on the desk. The trap had officially sprung in Manhattan, but the second jaw of the snare was waiting on Long Island. I turned my attention to the Onyx Capital software. The grace period for the predatory loan expired over 72 hours ago. My legal team had prepared all the necessary foreclosure documents, staging them in the municipal queue. They only required my final administrative authorization to execute the seizure. I placed my hand on the computer mouse. I moved the cursor over the final approval icon. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a sudden surge of misplaced daughterly guilt. I thought about the stale grocery store cupcake I ate alone in my rusted car. I thought about the decade of calculated silence. I clicked the button. The software processed the command instantly. The red indicator lights on the screen turned black. The default was finalized. In that exact second, an automated electronic transmission shot from my server to the County Sheriff Department on Long Island. Simultaneous notifications were dispatched to the regional banking authorities. The lien on Richard and Brenda Wilson's pristine suburban estate shifted from a pending status to an active foreclosure. Their property was no longer their own. The legal title belonged to Onyx Capital Partners. The eviction process was formally initiated, generating a certified digital notice that was instantly emailed to my father's phone. I sat in my office and visualized the sequence of events unfolding in Simon Caldwell's conference room. The commercial developer had walked out taking his millions of dollars with him. The realization that the warehouse sale was dead had just crashed over my parents. They were likely sitting in those leather chairs hyperventilating, trying to comprehend how their invisible daughter had outsmarted them. Then my father's cell phone would chime. He would pull the device from his pocket, expecting a message from a sympathetic colleague. Instead, he would see the automated legal notification from Onyx Capital. He would open the email. He would read the formal declaration of foreclosure. He would see the eviction timeline. The true horror of their situation would hit them in a suffocating wave. They would realize the catastrophic failure of their master plan. They tried to steal a building to save their home. In the span of a single hour, they lost both. The warehouse money vanished, and their suburban estate was seized by an anonymous creditor who showed zero mercy. They were cornered bankrupt and stripped of their prized social status. The safety net was gone. The ground beneath their feet had vanished. Desperation transforms people. It strips away their polite society costumes and leaves behind a raw, feral panic. My parents and my brother were now standing in the wreckage of their own entitlement. They had no money, no home, and no leverage. They only had one target left to blame for their spectacular downfall. I knew they would not accept defeat quietly. They would leave that law office and hunt down the daughter who refused to be their sacrificial lamb. They would demand answers, and they would demand them in person. I closed the Onyx dashboard and stood up from my desk. It was time to prepare the atrium. The real reunion was about to begin. I walked down the industrial steel staircase from my private office to the ground floor of the Brooklyn Food Hall. The Friday afternoon crowd was reaching its peak. Professionals ending their work week early mingled with local residents and tourists. The scent of roasted garlic, artisan-baked bread, and fresh espresso permeated the air. I bypassed the bustling vendor stalls and positioned myself in the center of the grand atrium. This sprawling open space featured soaring glass ceilings, reclaimed wood pillars, and a modern cascading water fountain. It was the perfect amphitheater for a reckoning. Naomi Reed stood next to me. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer holding a slim leather portfolio containing every legal document proving my ownership and the Onyx Capital defaults. Flanking us were two private security contractors I hired for the afternoon. They wore unmarked dark suits and discreet earpieces projecting a quiet, undeniable authority. Standing a few feet to my left was Elena Rostova, an investigative journalist for a prominent New York financial publication. I contacted her 3 weeks ago. She was writing a feature series on predatory lending and familial financial abuse among the suburban elite. I promised her the exclusive climax to a story involving a stolen trust fund, a fraudulent tech startup, and a multi-million-dollar real estate deception. Elena held a digital audio recorder. Her photographer stood nearby, adjusting the lens on a professional camera. The Wilson family had to cross the city from Midtown Manhattan. The heavy Friday traffic would give them an hour to let their panic fester into unhinged desperation. At 10 minutes past 4, the heavy revolving glass doors at the main entrance shuttered. Richard, Brenda, Derek, and Kelly pushed their way into the atrium. They looked profoundly disoriented. They expected to find a crumbling brick ruin, a desolate lot where they could corner a lonely woman away from prying eyes. Instead, they walked into a bustling, pristine commercial epicenter. They blinked against the bright natural light streaming through the skylights, their eyes darting across the polished concrete floors and thriving vendor stalls. The physical deterioration I noticed in Brenda earlier that morning had spread to the rest of them like a contagion. Richard looked 10 years older, his expensive silk tie loosened, his suit wrinkled from sitting in a panicked sweat. Derek looked frantic. He realized instantly that this building generated vast amounts of wealth he believed rightfully belonged to him. Derek spotted me standing by the central fountain. He did not care about the hundreds of patrons enjoying their afternoon meals. His entitlement overrode his social conditioning. He stormed across the atrium, his face flushed red with indignation. Richard and Brenda hurried behind him, trying to keep up while glancing nervously at the surrounding crowd. "What is this?" Derek shouted, his voice echoing off the glass ceiling. The ambient chatter of the food hall ground to a halt. Diners lowered their forks. Baristas stopped steaming milk. All eyes turned toward the commotion. You think you can steal my property and hide in this place? Derek demanded, closing the distance. You think you can just ignore the lawyers and ruin my life? I did not flinch. I kept my hands folded in front of me, maintaining my radical composure. I do not own your property, Derek, I said smoothly. I own mine. You owe us this building, Derek yelled, stepping dangerously close. My security contractors shifted their weight, stepping in to form a subtle and penetrable barrier between us. Derek ignored them, pointing a trembling finger at my face. You are a thief, he shouted. You manipulated grandfather into leaving this to you, and you stole the money we needed today. I am bankrupt because of you. Mom and Dad are losing their house because you threw a tantrum and refused to sign a simple piece of paper. The photographer standing next to Elena raised his camera. The rapid click of the shutter echoed through the tense silence. Bright white flashes illuminated Derek's furious, contorted face. Brenda gasped, finally noticing the journalist and the camera lens pointed directly at her family's disgrace. She reached out, tugging at her son's sleeve, realizing they were staging a public meltdown in front of the press. Naomi stepped forward, opening her leather portfolio. She did not raise her voice, but her trained legal cadence carried the weight of a judge delivering a verdict. Her words were designed to be recorded by Elena's device and witnessed by the silent crowd. My name is Naomi Reed, she stated clearly. I am the retained legal counsel for Mia Wilson. You are currently trespassing on private commercial property owned exclusively by my client. The deed was legally transferred through probate court 5 years ago, bypassing Richard Wilson due to documented attempts at executor fraud. Richard's face drained of all color. He looked around at the patrons, watching him, his carefully curated country club reputation evaporating into the scent of roasted coffee. This is a private family matter, Richard stammered, holding up his hands to block the camera flashes. We demand privacy. Turn that camera off. You forfeited your right to privacy when you attempted to extort my client in a Manhattan law office 3 hours ago, Naomi countered. But the quitclaim deed is only a fraction of your current legal exposure. You are operating under the false assumption that your daughter merely ruined your real estate transaction today. You are unaware of who truly holds your debt. The atrium was so quiet you could hear the water trickling in the central fountain. Derek stopped shouting, his brow furrowing in confusion. Brenda clutched her designer purse against her chest like a shield, her breathing shallow and erratic. Mia Wilson is not just the sole proprietor of this commercial center, Naomi announced, turning the portfolio around to display the corporate registry documents. She is also the chief executive officer of Onyx Capital Partners. The revelation hit them with the kinetic force of a freight train. Derek stumbled backward, his knees buckling slightly as the math clicked into place in his mind. The predatory private equity firm that funded his fake software company, the creditor that froze his bank accounts, the entity that just executed a foreclosure on his parents' suburban estate. It was all her. It was the sister they threw away. I stepped forward, closing the distance my security had created. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes. You spent my entire life pretending I was invisible, I said, keeping my tone conversational but piercing. You stole my childhood trust fund to cover a federal embezzlement charge for a son who never worked an honest day. You drained my future to buy his freedom, and then you called me capable to justify abandoning me. When you ran out of money today, you tried to steal my business to pay off a loan you defaulted on. You wanted to hand my building over to Onyx Capital. I gestured to the sprawling food hall around us, then back to the broken family standing in the center of it. I am Onyx Capital, I said. You tried to rob me to pay me, and now you have nothing left to steal. Elena scribbled furiously on her notepad. The photographer captured the exact moment Brenda's knees gave out. Richard caught his wife, lowering her to the polished concrete floor, his face a portrait of utter, irreversible ruin. The patrons in the atrium whispered among themselves, bearing witness to a real-time dismantling of a corrupt dynasty. The story of their financial abuse, their embezzlement cover-ups, and their current bankruptcy was now public record. The social circles they cherished on Long Island would read about their disgrace in the morning financial columns. The trap had snapped shut, leaving them exposed and bleeding in the center of the empire they tried to conquer. They were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their defeat, unable to process how thoroughly they had been outplayed. The public unraveling was complete. The truth was out in the open, documented and verified, leaving no room for their polished lies. But they could not stay in my building. The spectacle had reached its natural conclusion, and it was time to clear the debris from the floor. The silence enveloping the grand atrium stretched into an agonizing void. The revelation that their discarded daughter was the architect of their financial ruin paralyzed the four people standing before me. Richard knelt on the polished concrete floor, supporting his weeping wife. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He spent 40 years solving every complication with a heavy checkbook and a stern conversation. Today, his checkbook was frozen, his words carried zero authority, and the problem staring back at him owned the ground he knelt upon. Kelly backed away from her husband. Her eyes darted toward the exit. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood and spent her entire youth calculating a trajectory into high society. She married Derek Wilson, assuming he was an ascending prince of a suburban dynasty. Hearing my attorney declare that Derek was a fraud who squandered a stolen trust fund shattered her carefully constructed reality. She realized her golden ticket was actually an anchor, and she was currently drowning. Brenda refused to accept defeat. My mother possessed a feral survival instinct forged in the cutthroat environment of elite country club politics. When facts failed her, she always defaulted to theatrical manipulation. She used rumors and manufactured tears to destroy social rivals on Long Island for decades. She decided to deploy that exact playbook inside my commercial food hall. She pushed herself off the ground, brushing imaginary dust from her designer coat. She turned away from me and faced the crowd of silent patrons, her features contorted into a mask of pure agony. "Please, someone, help us!" Brenda wailed, her voice echoing off the soaring glass ceilings. "Look at what this monster is doing to her own flesh and blood. We gave her a beautiful childhood. We provided everything she ever needed. She ran away and broke our hearts. Now she is using some predatory legal loophole to steal the roof over our heads. She is tossing her elderly parents onto the street just to satisfy a petty grudge." She reached out her arms toward a couple sitting at a nearby reclaimed wood table. The diners recoiled, pulling their plates closer to their chests. "We just came here to talk to her," Brenda sobbed, tears cutting through the heavy makeup under her eyes. "We came to beg for her forgiveness, and she ambushed us with these thugs. Please call the authorities. She is extorting us." A younger version of myself might have reacted. A scared 20-year-old girl would have felt the overwhelming urge to defend her character, to shout the truth over the lies, to present the stolen trust fund ledger to the strangers eating lunch. But I was an estate appraiser. I understood that responding to a fraudulent claim only legitimizes the fraudster. I utilized the ultimate rule of calm drama. I did not raise my voice. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, projecting the serene, unbothered confidence of a woman who held undeniable leverage. I knew a fundamental truth about human psychology. In a room filled with chaotic shouting, the calmest person is always the one everyone instinctively believes. My silence amplified her hysteria. The crowd did not rally to her defense. They looked from her weeping, frantic face to my steady, composed posture. They remembered the clear legal verdict Naomi delivered just moments prior. They saw the investigative journalist standing to my left, holding a digital audio recorder to capture every single false syllable my mother uttered. Elena Rostova nodded at her photographer. The rapid clicking of the camera shutter resumed. Bright flashes illuminated Brenda as she stumbled through her desperate monologue. She was willingly providing the press with a spectacular visual finale for an article that would dismantle her pristine suburban reputation. Derek could not endure the shifted focus. His entire existence demanded that he remain the center of attention, even during a catastrophic failure. He realized his mother was losing the crowd. He lunged forward, trying to bypass my security detail. "Give me the building!" Derek screamed, his vocal cords straining until his voice cracked into a pathetic rasp. "You owe me this. You ruined my software company. You set me up with that loan. You knew I would miss the payment. You planned this entire thing to destroy my life because you were jealous. I will sue you for everything you own. I will drag you through civil court until you are begging for a settlement." His threats were completely empty. He could not afford a consultation with a junior paralegal, let alone mount a massive civil litigation campaign against a multi-million-dollar holding company. He was a bankrupt man screaming at a mountain, demanding the rock bow down to his ego. The spectacle reached its natural, exhausted limit. The public unraveling served its purpose. The undeniable truth of their financial crimes and their toxic entitlement was now a matter of public record, witnessed by hundreds of independent patrons and documented by a reputable financial publication. It was time to clear the hazardous waste from my property. I made eye contact with the lead private security contractor standing to my right. I did not speak a word. I delivered a single deliberate nod. The contractor tapped his earpiece, signaling his partner. The two men moved with swift, terrifying military precision. They did not strike my family. They did not draw weapons. They simply flanked the broken dynasty, using their imposing physical presence to corral the chaos. "Sir, it is time to leave the premises," the lead contractor stated. His voice was flat, carrying zero emotion and absolute authority. "You are trespassing. Walk toward the exit immediately." Derek tried to shove the contractor. The guard effortlessly absorbed the impact, stepping forward and gripping my brother's upper arm with fingers like steel vices. The second guard mirrored the action, taking hold of Richard by the elbow. "Get your hands off my husband," Brenda shrieked, abandoning her victim narrative and reverting to her entitled rage. "Do you know who we are? We will have your jobs. We will destroy your agency." The guards ignored her. They propelled Derek and Richard forward, marching them down the central aisle of the atrium. The physical momentum forced Brenda and Kelly to follow, scrambling to keep up with the forced march. The procession moved past the artisanal bakery stalls and the craft espresso counters. The patrons parted like the Red Sea, pulling their chairs out of the way to avoid the toxic spill passing through their dining room. Derek continued to thrash and curse, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against my polished concrete floors. His frantic resistance only made him look smaller, a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because his toys were finally confiscated. I remained standing by the cascading water fountain. I watched them walk the entire length of the grand atrium. I did not follow them. Rulers do not chase exiled peasants to the border. They watch from the throne. The security guards reached the front vestibule. They shoved the heavy revolving glass doors in motion. They released their grip, pushing Derek and Richard through the spinning panels. Brenda and Kelly stumbled out behind them. The cold New York wind whipped through the opening, carrying the bitter chill of early November. It hit my family as they spilled out onto the concrete sidewalk. They lost their balance, clustering together near the curb. They looked back through the glass, pressing their hands against the transparent barrier. My posture remained flawless. My face showed zero regret, zero anger, and zero sorrow. I looked through the glass at the people who stole my childhood trust fund, the people who erased my birthday for a decade, the people who tried to trick me out of my grandfather's warehouse to fund a fake software empire. I appraised their final threats. I calculated the value of their anger. I found them entirely bankrupt. They held zero currency in my world. Elena stood beside me, watching the scene unfold outside. The feature article she would publish on Monday morning was already writing itself in her head. The piece would detail the Onyx Capital foreclosure. It would expose the embezzlement cover-up at the logistics firm. It would feature high-resolution photographs of Brenda crying on the floor of a food hall she tried to steal. That resulting media coverage would ensure the Wilson family could never show their faces in their elite social circles again. The country club board would revoke their membership by Tuesday. Their wealthy neighbors would cross the street to avoid them. The suburban society they sacrificed my future to impress would ultimately devour them. They would be forced to pack their belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and move into a cramped rental apartment, carrying the heavy, inescapable stench of public disgrace. The revolving doors slowed to a halt, sealing the cold air outside. The ambient noise of the food hall slowly returned. The clatter of silverware resumed. The baristas began steaming milk. Life inside my kingdom continued entirely unbothered by the ghosts I just exorcised from the premises. The siege was over. The battle was won. I turned away from the glass doors and looked at Naomi Reed. The attorney offered a rare, genuine smile, closing her leather portfolio. I nodded my thanks, feeling a profound, radiant warmth spreading through my chest. The toxic debris was gone, and there was a birthday dinner waiting to be served. The sun set over the Long Island suburbs, painting the evening sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. Inside the sprawling Wilson estate, the ambient temperature felt 10 degrees colder than the autumn air outside. The grand foyer was once a pristine showcase of imported marble and curated art. Tonight, it resembled a sterile shipping warehouse. Cheap brown cardboard boxes sat stacked haphazardly against the custom mahogany wainscoting. The sharp tearing sound of packing tape echoed down the barren hallways, severing the suffocating silence. Richard sat on a folded moving blanket in the center of the formal dining room. The heavy oak table where they hosted countless elite charity dinners was gone. He sold it to a liquidator yesterday for pennies on the dollar just to cover basic packing supplies. He held a white paper carton of cheap takeout noodles. The food was cold, the grease congealed near the bottom of the container. He stared at the blank wall, chewing mechanically. His tailored suit was replaced by rumpled sweatpants. His posture was broken, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a catastrophic defeat. Brenda sat on a taped box a few feet away. She wore a faded cashmere sweater holding a glass of lukewarm tap water. Her designer makeup was washed away, revealing the deep, exhausted lines carving into her face. The silence between the two of them was toxic and heavy. They possessed nothing left to say to one another. The foundation of their marriage rested on social superiority and financial leverage. With both pillars shattered, the structure collapsed entirely, leaving two strangers trapped in the ruins of their own arrogance. Their cell phones rested on the hardwood floor, silent and dark. Elena Rostova published her digital feature article late that afternoon. The story spread through the country club group chats like a digital wildfire. The piece detailed the stolen trust fund, the fraudulent logistics firm cover-up, and the Onyx Capital foreclosure. The social exile was instantaneous. Elite society functions like a biological immune system. It detects a compromised cell and isolates it immediately. Former friends blocked their numbers. Charity boards scrubbed their names from the donor registries. The neighborhood association issued a sterile email revoking their gate access codes, effective at midnight. Derek was nowhere to be seen. The Golden Child abandoned the sinking ship hours ago. When he realized the bank accounts were drained and the house was lost, he packed his remaining designer clothes into garbage bags. He and Kelly fled to a budget motel near the interstate highway. He even stole his mother's remaining pearl necklace from her vanity drawer before he walked out the door. Without a trust fund to drain or a pristine house to use as collateral, Derek found his parents entirely useless. He discarded them the exact same way they discarded me 9 years ago. The cycle of utility reached its inevitable, ruthless conclusion. A crisp white legal document rested on the kitchen island. It was the official eviction order, signed by a county judge on behalf of Onyx Capital Partners. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, armed sheriff deputies would arrive to change the locks and escort the former owners off the premises. Richard and Brenda would walk out the front door carrying cheap cardboard boxes, stepping into a world that no longer recognized their names. They were bankrupt in spirit, in status, and in legacy. 30 miles away, the audio landscape shifted from the dead silence of suburban defeat to the vibrant, rhythmic pulse of a Brooklyn evening. The heavy glass doors of my commercial food hall were locked to the general public. The closing signs hung in the windows, but the interior radiated with a brilliant, warm light. Soft jazz music played through the overhead speakers, blending seamlessly with the ambient hum of a thriving community. I pushed 2 long, reclaimed wood tables together in the center of the polished concrete floor, forming a sprawling banquet station. The harsh fluorescent lighting of a grocery store parking lot was replaced by strings of warm Edison bulbs suspended from the steel rafters above. The scent of roasted garlic-seared steaks and fresh basil drifted from the open commercial kitchens. My artisan vendors volunteered to cater the evening, pulling their finest ingredients to craft a feast that rivaled any elite Manhattan restaurant. I sat at the head of the table. I did not sit near the swinging kitchen doors, dodging busy waiters. I occupied the center of gravity, surrounded by a chosen family that earned their seats through loyalty and mutual respect. Naomi Reed sat to my right, holding a glass of deep ruby wine. The ruthless real estate attorney traded her sharp courtroom demeanor for genuine, relaxed laughter. She shared a brilliant legal anecdote with my lead security contractor, who sat across from her enjoying a plate of artisanal cured meats. Elena Rostova sat further down the line, chatting with the master baker who leased my largest ground floor retail stall. My property management staff, the vendors, the local business owners who thrived under my commercial umbrella, they all gathered together, filling every available chair. The space hummed with rich, overlapping conversations. Glasses clinked in rolling, cheerful toasts. The warmth in the room was not a manufactured performance designed to secure a signature on a quitclaim deed. It was authentic, organic, and deeply rooted in shared success. I looked down the length of the polished wood, absorbing the vibrant energy. I appraised the people sitting around me. I calculated their value in my life and found the total immeasurable. The overhead lights dimmed slightly. A hush fell over the long table. The master baker emerged from his kitchen carrying a large, pristine, tiered cake. The white frosting gleamed under the soft, ambient light. 29 candles flickered on the top tier, casting a dancing golden glow across the room. The entire table erupted into a spontaneous, joyful rendition of the traditional birthday song. The voices blended together, echoing off the high glass ceilings and the exposed brick walls. I watched the tiny flames flicker, feeling the heat radiate against my skin. 9 years ago, I sat alone in a rusted compact car, eating a stale, leftover cupcake. I believed my worth was dictated by the people who refused to set a place for me at their mahogany table. I allowed their toxic math to define my existence. I thought survival meant turning myself into an invisible ghost, hiding behind corporate holding companies and rural antique shops. But survival is only the first step. The true victory lies in reconstruction. The cheap blue pen my father tried to use as a weapon was rusting at the bottom of a municipal trash can. The quitclaim deed my mother tried to force upon me was shredded in a legal vault. The predatory loan they signed to save a fraudulent son became the very instrument that severed my ties to them forever. The baker placed the glowing cake directly in front of me. The warmth of the 29 candles illuminated the faces of everyone watching. Naomi offered a subtle, respectful nod. The community I cultivated smiled back at me, waiting for me to make a wish. I did not need to make a wish. Every desire I ever harbored was already sitting in the room. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the rich, savory air. I opened my eyes and blew out the candles, extinguishing the flames in a single breath. The table erupted into loud applause and cheering. The bright overhead lights switched back on, signaling the start of the feast. Wine poured freely into crystal glasses. Heavy plates of hot, delicious food were passed down the line. I picked up my silver fork, ready to enjoy a meal I earned with my own 2 hands. Belonging is not a privilege your relatives grant you. It is not a chair you beg someone else to pull out for you while you wait in the shadows. Belonging is an empire you construct from the dirt up. I looked at the sprawling feast, the radiant faces, and the towering brick walls enclosing my kingdom. I finally took my seat at a table entirely secure in the knowledge that I was the one who built the chairs.